Hello, hello, and welcome back once again to Leninhawk Talk, which I've tried to make rhyme. This is episode 3, and episode 2 did a lot better than episode 1 so far. I mean, did a lot better by my channel's accolades, not by YouTube in general accolades. I'm still in like low double digits, but, show must go on. So the last episode was about Neve Campbell saying no to the offer to be in Scream 6 because they apparently lowballed her salary. And you can go back and listen to that episode if you're interested in all my thoughts on that. But after I recorded that episode, I started seeing rumblings on Twitter about Scream 6. One is that it's in principal photography right now. I thought it was still in pre-production, but I guess they started filming. But also that apparently this new Scream film takes place in New York City. Now, Scream 5, or Scream, or 5 Cream, or whatever, that was filmed in Wilmington, North Carolina, to double for Woodsboro. Woodsboro takes place it's a fictional town in California, and it was originally, for the original Scream in 96, it was filmed in California, I believe about an hour north of Los Angeles, give or take. But now, Scream 6, they had moved the filming location to Canada, and people were wondering, why move it to Canada instead of either filming it in California or filming it in North Carolina if you're doing Woodsboro again. And it appears it's because, it doesn't take place in Woodsboro. Now, some people on Twitter were a little bit upset about this news. They were like, oh, it's not Scream if it doesn't take place in Woodsboro. Or maybe it was just sort of the bridge too far that you have no Sidney Prescott and it's not in Woodsboro. But you have to remember, not all of these films take place in Woodsboro. Scream 2, arguably the best Scream sequel, at least that's my opinion. You may feel differently. But Scream 2 is my favorite of the sequels, and that takes place in a college outside of Woodsboro. I'm not sure. I forget where the college is. I think it was filmed in Ohio, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if it takes place there or if it was just another California location. And then Scream 3, which I consider to be non-canon because it sucks, but, that's just my own opinion. That takes place, obviously, in Hollywood, in Los Angeles. So, I mean, we've left Woodsboro before. It went back to Woodsboro for Scream 4 and then Scream 5. But there's nothing inherent in the story where it needs to take place in Woodsboro. Now, the fact that we have no Woodsboro and no Sidney Prescott, I think if it was just one or the other, I think it would be less of a deal to some fans. But I think having neither of those in this new film is what's sort of ticking some people off. But then other people were pretty excited. I mean, if you're a general fan of horror and not just a fan of the Scream films, you'll know that there was, in the late 80s, Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. And that film did not deliver on the promise of its title because it mostly takes place on a boat, because apparently a lake will connect to the Atlantic Ocean. And get there. I mean, I guess technically Camp Crystal Lake is supposed to be in New Jersey. So, if the lake did spill out into the ocean, you could get to New York City. It just seems like a lake, by normal definition, is a enclosed body of water and doesn't have outlets to an ocean. But, neither here nor there. But then only a little bit of that movie takes place in New York City. And even then, most of it was also Canada, I believe Toronto in this case, doubling for New York City, only like the Times Square scene. And Jason's behavior within New York City isn't really normal. Like, he's on a subway, but he's only going after certain people, or he's in Times Square and he shows his face as opposed to killing these punks. So Jason also acts a little bit out of character in that movie for being in New York City. So, but Ghostface in New York City, that has potential. Because, that's just a regular person who puts on this costume. So, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind would be Ghostface stalking somebody in the New York subway system. I mean, that's just ripe for a great suspenseful slasher scene. Or Ghostface, pushing someone in front of a train or anything like that. Ghostface in a high-rise, attacking someone in an elevator, they can't get out. I mean, there's lots of different sequences you can do by putting Ghostface in an urban setting, which we haven't really seen him in before. We've seen him in suburbs, and we've seen him in, around a movie studio. They didn't really take much much advantage of the Los Angeles setting in Scream 3. They didn't take advantage of a lot of things in Scream 3. And we've had the college setting, obviously, but we haven't really seen him in an urban setting, high rises, buildings with doormen, that sort of thing. And now, canonically, from Scream 5, we do know that Gale Weathers, Courtney Cox, she lives in New York City. She does some sort of morning news program there. So that makes sense that it would be there. But also we have to remember that New York City is home in real life to some of the best film schools in the United States. NYU Film comes to mind. I remember back when I was in high school, I was thinking of going to NYU Film, and for various reasons, most of them with my own personal mental state at the time, I didn't even bother applying. But it would make sense if we know a couple things. We know that the actress, I forget the actress's name, so my apologies there, but the one who plays Randy's niece, it seems very obvious that that character would want to go to a film school. She's also on Yellow Jackets, by the way, which is a great television show. But it makes sense that she would want to go to a film school. We know Kirby, Hayden and Panettiere, is back, and I can certainly see Kirby being a film professor, especially at a top film school. I mean, so some of the reasons for that make sense. Also, you have to remember, for all of the other surviving characters who, they go to Woodsboro High School and everything, if you suffer a traumatic event, chances are you want to go to college as far away from there as possible. I don't think a lot of people who were involved in, let's say, the Columbine high school shooting wanted to go to college within driving distance of their high school. They probably wanted to abscond as far away from there as possible. So it makes sense that if Woodsboro was in California and you have these people who went through this very traumatic event finally graduating, they might want to go to college 3,000 miles away. Now, I should say the proof that this movie is taking place, at least partially in New York City, we don't know if the whole movie takes place there, but it's basically from people on Twitter. They live or they are around the area where it's filming. I don't think they're actual extras, but they were seeing where the shoot was happening, where the street where it's closed down, and they had New York City police and rescue vehicles parked on the street with New York license plates. So obviously some part of this movie takes place there. So then the first thing I would think of is, if the whole movie doesn't take place in New York City, then maybe just the opening takes place. Maybe Gale Weathers is the opening victim in this case, the killing off the final non-Sydney survivor. But some of the people who have been reporting from this street where the scene was being filmed, they're saying that it did not look like it was the opening. I mean, not that you can tell from the street, but that it looked like a scene involving a frat party. And then, so that's also what perked my mind up about this is sort of the going to college 3,000 miles away idea, or the NYU film, or some sort of fictional equivalent of NYU if they don't want to use NYU's actual letters, because obviously the college in Scream 2 is a fictional college. I think it was Windsor College, if I'm not mistaken. So it sort of makes sense that, this is kind of what the plot's going to be. You have the Woodsboro survivors going to college in New York. Randy's niece is going film. Kirby can be a film professor there. And obviously that this involves Gale Weathers because that's now her home turf. But this definitely does seem like a good direction, at least in my opinion. Some people were a little fluky about it because of the non-Woodsboro thing. But I think having Ghostface in an urban setting really makes sense as far as the different sequences you can do that would make this completely different from the other Scream films. If you want to just sort of break it up, open the world a little bit, and then, you can obviously have, Ghostface going through the subway system, or, there could be some sort of stab or horror convention where you have a bunch of Ghostface at, some sort of convention center where they normally have Comic-Con there or anything. There's a lot of different things you can do with that setting that would still make sense and not break the universe as far as incorporating this sort of urban thing to it. And if they are incorporating an NYU type college, then you do still get that little flavor of stalking a college campus thing that we had in Scream 2 as well. So... but we still don't know what the basics of the plot are, but it seems like we've had mainstream horror press reporting on this New York thing now, so it's not just a bunch of people pontificating on Twitter. It does seem to be confirmed to some extent, but we still don't know really enough to kind of go off on it. But I just wanted to kind of throw in my 2 cents there as far as New York as a setting for Scream 6. I thought that would be, I don't know, I think it's a good idea. So, we'll see how it goes. We'll see what else might leak from production. I guess, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about sort of Scream leaks in the past. Obviously, the first movie, nobody knew it was going to be a big deal, so there wasn't no leaks of it. No one knew it was something to be leaked. And then Scream 2 entered production so quickly after that. That movie ended up getting released almost a year to the date. Actually, a little bit earlier. As I recall, so Scream 1 was released on December 20th of 96. As I recall, Scream 2 was released maybe a week earlier than that the following year, like December 13th or something like that. I don't know if it was a Friday the 13th in 1997, but I think it was slightly less than a year, so there was a quick turnaround. But on top of that, the original script, or at least the original ending of Scream 2 was leaked. And 1997 didn't have as many like internet leaks. I'm not even sure if Ain't It Cool News was around back then, because they were the big movie website that had like leaks and people reporting reviews from test screenings and stuff like that. But it had a completely different ending. I remember the Jerry O'Connell character, Sidney's boyfriend, was actually one of the real killers instead of Mickey, so they changed it. Cotton Weary was actually going to be evil and try to kill Sidney at the end, too, even though he wasn't one of the Ghostface killers. I believe that Scream 2 draft, I've seen people who have bought copies of it at like conventions and stuff, but I'm pretty sure that draft is available online if you look for it. I should actually look for it. I haven't actually read it myself. I just kind of know secondhand what that was about. So you basically had a film that was written and entered into production less than a year from that, and then it did leak, and so they had to release another one. And I remember after it was rewritten and they were filming it, that was one of the first movies where the script was printed on like the red paper with the black font so that it couldn't be photocopied, so that if you put it over a copier it would just be just black mush. That doesn't matter so much these days, where people have like scanners and stuff where you could make a copy that way. But back in the day, before scanners, when there was just photocopies, that was like a piracy or a leak proof thing that went there. And I remember when they rewrote the script, the new ending they did not give to any of the actors until they were ready to film. I believe Nev Campbell was quoted in one of the EPK press junket interviews as saying the end of her script cut off like 10 to 15 pages before the ending, and all it said at the bottom was "people live, people die." So they were really regimented on that. And then Scream 3 came out, I believe, 2 years after that, or actually a little bit, 3 years after. Scream 3 didn't come out till 2000. So it was 3 years after Scream 2. And I don't remember a lot of the situation around Scream 3 as far as if they were worried about leaks or how that was going. I mostly remember just being hugely disappointed that Kevin Williamson wrote a treatment for Scream 3, and apparently his original treatment was going to go back to Woodsboro, and the Weinsteins rejected it, and so they went with worst screenwriter in Hollywood, Aaron Kruger, to write the bullshit about the film production. And then we all know how terribly Scream 3 turned out. I don't know, maybe there's some Scream 3 defenders or Scream 3 stans who are listening to this. Just know that you're wrong. But I don't remember. I think by then, because between Scream 2 and Scream 3, there were a bunch of Scream-adjacent knockoffs of these like neo-slashers that weren't too violent, that had no nudity, and had like super, super pretty casts from TV shows. You had I Know What You Did Last Summer, and Urban Legend, and Valentine, and all of these like sort of disposable ones. I mean, some of these have their own merit. Whether I Know What You Did Last Summer and I Still Know are okay. Valentine I'm not a big fan of. Urban Legends, the Jamie Blanks directed movies. But you had a lot of those, so by then the market had kind of become saturated, whereas when Scream came out, there were really no other slashers that were coming out in theaters, let alone self-referential ones. And then some other people struck while the iron was hot around the Scream 2 era. But then by the time 2000 hits, because Scream 3 came out in, I believe, February of 2000, that genre had kind of petered out. And you were starting to see the movies that were aimed at the same audience were not horror movies. They were teen sex comedies like American Pie and Road Trip and stuff like that. That was sort of replacing it. so that, by the time you get to Scream 3, you have fucking Jay and Silent Bob showing up in there and all that other bullshit. So, so I don't remember as much of a big, like, looking for the leaks type of stuff there. I do remember, now that I'm thinking about it, I do remember when Scream 3 was in production, since I was still following, because having loved Scream and loved Scream 2, I had high hopes for Scream 3 coming out, which were dashed. But I do remember following some of the news, so I do remember that horrible scene of, like, Randy having, like, pre-recorded a VHS tape about trilogies. I do remember that news had leaked, as well as I think Heather Matazzaro playing his sister had leaked at the time as well. I mean, obviously that scene is terrible and shoehorned in, but I did like Heather Matazzaro because I really liked Welcome to the Dollhouse, the Todd Solondz film. And then later on, obviously, she'd gone on to do, like, Hostel Part 2, but that was, like, much, much later. And then when Scream 4 was finally announced, I'm trying to remember the situation around Scream 4, because that was, 10, 11 years ago now. I do remember it was kind of unexpected, but it was happening around the time that all of those Hollywood was remaking classic horror films, like hard reboots. So you're not doing, like, what they're doing now, where they're basically, like, belated sequels with legacy characters. They were just, you had Hills Have Eyes and Hills Have Eyes was the first one that came to mind because it's one of the actual good ones. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, they had just every horror property from the 80s and some from the 90s were just being, like, hard rebooted in the early 2000s. And so the idea of basically doing a legacy sequel before legacy sequels became the thing was what was going on there. I don't remember too much leaking from that. I do remember... there's the scene in Scream 4 where one of the girls is, like, disemboweled and you see her, like, entrails on the bed. I do remember photos of that coming out in maybe Fangoria. So they didn't reveal, like, who was killed, but at least they were showing that they've amped up the gore a little bit. And I remember the casting announcements and all of that stuff. But I don't remember any, like, hard leaks about that storyline coming out or anything. I also think they sort of revealed a decent amount of the setup of that plot in the pre-marketing. The idea that Dewey was sheriff, that Sidney that Dewey and Gale were married, that Sidney, Dewey and Gale being married, they get engaged at the end of Scream 3. But that Sidney had, like, written a book and was sort of coming to grips with things. Mostly because I remember when they announced Alison Brie's casting as her agent. I think that's when that came out. But there wasn't as much of a frenzy there. But now, obviously, we're in a different, even from 10 years ago, we're in a different age of leaks and all that stuff where everyone's chasing down what's happening in the next Star Wars project or Marvel project. And, Scream is sort of one of those things. So even outside of, like, who the killers are, because no one really wants that spoiled for themselves before they go into the movie, people are sort of wondering, like, what's the setup here? What's the plot? What new characters are we adding? How is the story progressing from where we left off in the last one? And now, of course, we have the big question of how are they writing Sidney out of this one? If Sidney is not going to be a part of this one, then what are we saying? Are we saying that she's completely avoiding it? Are we just going to say that the killer has no interest in Sidney, that this killer is really just about the new group or just about Gale? Or how is all of that going to be integrated? But I think at least at this point, we can sort of solidify that it's probably going to involve our legacy or our new characters, rather, not our legacy characters, but our new characters going to college, and based on the inclusion of the Kirby character, that at least Randy's niece is in film school. That's what I'm willing to call on there. But I think it is an exciting turn, and I look forward to seeing what they do with it. So that was just my little thoughts on Scream 6 apparently taking place in New York City. Are you excited about it? Do you not like this turn? Do you think it might be good? Leave a comment below. And as always, like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all those things a good YouTuber is supposed to say to do. And yeah, as soon as I think of something else I want to kind of ramble about for a little bit, we'll have an episode 4. But feel free to go back and listen to my last episode, which is about Neve Campbell deciding not to be in Scream 6, or go back to my first episode, which was about the Morbius re-release and Sony's sort of attempting to glomp onto the memeing of that film, as well as Louis C.K. and Kevin Spacey having new movies. It just was announced today, obviously, that Kevin Spacey is being formally charged in the UK for sex crimes, so that'll... we'll see how that goes. Maybe he won't get more roles, but maybe he will. Who knows? But thanks, everybody, and hope you have a good one.